She said she'd been kidnapped, beaten, left for dead in a remote Arizona field, but none of it was real. Because by the time Marissa DeVault staged her own attack, her husband was already dead, killed in his sleep with a claw hammer, and police were starting to realise that nothing she said could be trusted. This is part 2 of the murder case of Dale Harrell. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen now because everything from here only gets darker. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. So, Marissa had been arrested for the murder of her husband Dale, and there's this $300,000 owed to her lover, or more accurately sugar daddy, Alan Flores. And her roommate and family friend Stan Cook has confessed, but the evidence isn't adding up. And so, after Marissa is charged, the case eventually goes to trial. During that trial, the jury heard lots of stories. Some were tragic, some were shocking, and some were almost too bizarre to believe. But there was one in particular, one version of events that didn't involve hammers or husbands or bloodied bedrooms. Instead, it just started in the middle of nowhere. And I've got to say that I actually hadn't included this part initially because I really didn't understand why or how it had become a thing. It's so unbelievable and random, but Marissa did say this happened, so let me just tell you what I learnt. According to Marissa, she'd been kidnapped, snatched off the street by a stranger, driven into the Arizona desert, beaten within inches of her life and dumped in a remote rocky clearing where no one was supposed to find her. She said her jaw had been shattered, her ankle was crushed, and her body was just generally very bruised and broken. She told investigators she had to crawl across the desert floor and she was bloodied and dazed and literally dragging herself towards help. She said she'd been targeted, someone had tried to silence her. And if any of that had been true, it would have been the most horrifying twist in an already tragic case, but of course, it wasn't true. Because by the time Marissa was spinning that tale, it was actually weeks after Dale had been killed. And when detectives looked closer, they discovered that there was no record of a kidnapping, there was no police report, no ambulance logs, no ER paperwork, there was literally nothing. She had injuries, yes, she had a wired jaw, a swollen ankle, real bruises, but not from any attack. According to prosecutors, those wounds were self-inflicted or staged, carefully planned to shift suspicion. She wanted to look like a victim again. The problem was, this time, the timeline didn't work. The story just did not add up. I know, it really doesn't make a lot of sense, hence why I was like, wait a minute, hold on. What is this bit about an attack on Marissa? Because just like everything else in this case, when Marissa spun lies, she went full on with them. Anyway, Stanley Cook Jr., who had, as we know, earlier confessed involvement in Dale's assault, he was found to be complicit in this new deception. Together, they had conspired to make this narrative that would sway both public sympathy and the police's investigation. Behind it all lay a really fragile kind of front. Marissa claimed memory gaps, confusion, and trauma-induced blackouts. Whether genuine or carefully crafted, no one could say for sure. We know Marissa was eventually pushed into a kind of confession, but her words were really slippery. There were part truths, part fiction. It was an ever-changing kind of puzzle account that completely defied actual truth. At trial, the different versions of what had happened that night were presented so that the jury could really see the extent of the lies. At first, there was the intruder, the mysterious, violent stranger who had broken into the home, attacking Dale In a rage no one could explain, but we know that evidence never quite matched up. There was no sign of forced entry, no DNA, no footprints that didn't belong. Then came the version involving Stanley Cook Jr., the man who confessed to involvement in the attack. And then the most shocking twist of all, self-defense. Marissa claimed that she, battered and broken from years of abuse, had finally fought back and killed Dale to save herself and her children. It was a story desperate enough to draw sympathy, but the police and prosecutors were skeptical. The blood spatter, the wounds, the timing, none of it quite fit her account. Then came something that would become key at trial. It was this 300-page confession that seemed to shift bits. It was typed, it was meticulous, and it detailed a version of events that was extremely contradictory. It pulled in new players and cast doubt on old ones, and it really painted Marissa simultaneously as victim and also kind of architect of this chaos. The stakes at trial were impossibly high because the death penalty was on the table. The defence went with battered women syndrome, PTSD, years of abuse and torment etched into every corner of her psyche, shaping a woman that was pushed beyond the brink. The defence painted Marissa not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a battered mother, haunted and broken, who had lived through unspeakable physical and sexual violence at the hands of Dale. They argued that Marissa's trauma justified her desperate actions, a final, violent stand to protect herself and her 3 daughters from this nightmare that outsiders just couldn't fully understand. They pointed to the peculiar choice of weapon, a hammer. They asked the jury to consider why, if Marissa intended murder, she would ignore the arsenal of guns owned by her roommate. It was a question that cut to the heart of intent. This was not premeditation, they said, but instead a chaotic act born from survival. They emphasised the existence of Marissa's trust fund, a secret financial cushion that eliminated money as motive, and it highlighted Alan's shadowy role in this case. Alan, the wealthy lover who had loaned her hundreds of thousands of dollars and held the strings behind the scenes, was actually granted complete immunity. It was a deal that he struck with prosecutors in exchange for his testimony, which I found a weird choice. They do have a shit ton of evidence, but I guess his testimony is only going to strengthen the prosecution's case. But even so, we know that he helped to edit Stan's confession on his computer, so the thinking that he may have had something to do with the planning, or at least cover up afterwards, I don't think it's that far-fetched. But that's just my opinion, and given his immunity, he's never been tried or convicted of anything to do with Dale's murder. Anyway, the defence warned the jury not to be fooled by Alan's polished testimony, branding him a master manipulator who twisted confessions and controlled narratives to serve his own interests. And they did speak about how Alan had orchestrated Stan's confession to make sure he would eventually get the benefits of Dale's life insurance policy because, remember, Marissa had named him as a beneficiary. Under oath, Alan took the stand. The prosecution laid bare his complex role in this kind of tangled web surrounding Dale's death. Alan recounted receiving a frantic phone call from Marissa as she told him that her husband had been killed in a violent confrontation. Her roommate Stanley, Alan said, had also confirmed that Dale had been struck with a tire iron. Immediately, Alan offered to come to Marissa's side to provide comfort and support in this chaos, but she refused outright. She told him to stay away. Adding to this kind of unease, Alan testified that just the day before the hammer attack, he'd arrived unannounced to Marissa's home, only to find it empty. And to his shock, he learnt that Marissa was out with her husband, Dale. This really unsettled Alan. He'd been under the impression that Dale was out of the picture, and the fact that he kept learning that Marissa was spending more and more time with him just made him start to question her story and her side of what had been going on. This case, the defence insisted, was about hidden domestic violence. The jury needed to see past the financial intrigue and focus on the abuse, the trauma, the instinct to protect children from a violent father. Marissa was justified in her actions, they argued. Her desperate act was a tragic but necessary defence. But the prosecution laid out a far darker narrative, one of cold, calculated premeditation driven by greed and deceit. They claimed Marissa had plotted Dale's death long before the hammer attack. They marked his birthday in 2008 in December as the day that she initially intended to execute her plan. According to the prosecution, Marissa had hired a hitman to kill Dale at a local casino. She planned to send him out to the car park only for the plan to unravel. Undeterred, they said that she had quickly devised a backup scheme to kill Dale herself while he slept. The chilling evidence, they claimed, included a call to Alan confirming the failure of the hit. Again, it's very cold, it's very calculated, it's very premeditated. Now, when it came to claims of domestic violence, the prosecution exposed a stark silence, kind of, and we'll go back and forth because there's testimony from the children later on that again contradict, but for now we're with the prosecution, and they present that no neighbours have ever witnessed abuse, no friends have ever heard screams or seen bruises, and the detectives' inquiries turned up no corroborating evidence. Police records showed no calls reporting violence. There were no hospital logs for the injuries that Marissa had described. But the defence brought forward a friend of Marissa's, Harrell, a woman who claimed a close bond through their children's school, but her memories were quite vague, to be honest. I mean, obviously I don't know, but I get the sense that she was not as close to Marissa as she alluded to. Oh, I don't know. Aisha described this kind of tension in the household, and she admitted discomfort when she was around Dale, saying that he was distant from the children's lives. But she did speak of Marissa having a black eye and said she hid it under dark sunglasses. She also spoke about her gradual weight loss over time. Aisha, surprisingly, though, couldn't remember the name of Marissa's children, and she couldn't actually testify to ever witnessing Dale abusing Marissa. So you see why I say I'm not entirely convinced she was like a super close friend of Marissa, but she said she was. Another friend echoed similar sentiments, painting a picture of a marriage steeped in control and fear. She testified that Marissa was rarely allowed to kind of speak freely without Dale being there. And she said she had seen bruises on Marissa before, and from her point of view, she was certain that the abuse had been present. But as I mentioned, it was the voices of the children that really held weight. Marissa's daughter Rhiannon, that's the one from the beginning of the case, she was in her bedroom when police and paramedics arrived. She took the stand and she spoke about the chaos that really had defined her childhood. She described a home that was overtaken by betrayal and violence, where both parents strayed, had affairs. She spoke about Dale returning home with the scent of other women's perfume on his clothes and lipstick smudged on his neck. And this girl is 13 when Dale is killed, so she's knowing this, she's under the impression, she's aware that Dale and her mum are having affairs, and she's just so young. It's just a horrible place for a child to be growing up. Rhiannon also admitted to seeing both her mother and her father hit each other, though Dale's violence was more frequent and brutal. And this was a real turning point for me. I mean, it doesn't change any of the other mountains of evidence, but it was the first time we actually hear of evidence relating to abuse against Marissa. When asked if she ever saw Dale hit her mother, she said yes. And she described the tension that forced them to kind of hide. The violence was not reserved for adults alone either. Rhiannon confessed to being hit herself, punished for being bad, and when asked if her mother had ever hit her, she hesitated but admitted she would slap me or kick me. And when those marks showed, her mother had taught her how to cover them up with makeup. Secrets passed from mother to daughter. It's truly such a tragic realisation, and in the book it's so clear that this was a sobering and very painful moment. And up to this point, I had not a lot of sympathy for Marissa, to be honest. I thought she was lying out of her arse, and as I say, it doesn't change any of the evidence, but it does give you a bit more of an idea of the context of this family house. Kiernan, the middle daughter, spoke of a steak knife lodged in the ceiling of her bedroom, and this was a moment of Dale's rage. She also remembered toys smashed and destroyed in other moments of fury. The youngest daughter, Dianan, spoke quietly but with a lot of clarity. She spoke about the physical toll of the abuse and how it took its toll on her mother. Quote, "I miss my mum. I want her back, even if everyone thinks bad of her." And Marissa testified that she had a protective order against Dale, but the truth was no protective order had ever been filed. One juror questioned the defence's claims though. It was obvious there was abuse, but this juror asked that if Dale held such power and control, how could Marissa have, 1, worked as a stripper, and 2, carried on an affair so openly? And this juror is really clear in the book. They have suffered abuse themselves, and they're comparing it to their own experience and saying that just would never have been a reality, and so they couldn't quite compute how Marissa had been allowed that freedom. The defense called a clinical psychologist to the stand, and she testified that Marissa had suffered a psychotic episode in her past, but the exact kind of nature of what that episode wasn't revealed. But it was clear that Marissa had dealt with severe depression, and the psychologist also detailed the PTSD that caused Marissa to have these kind of dissociative episodes, moments where reality blurred and fractured under the strain of trauma. But the prosecution really wanted to make the jury see the reality of the brutality of the crime scene. They brought us back to the crime scene. They presented the blurry photographs, the ones taken by that officer who had arrived at the scene, and they captured Dale's battered body lying on the bedroom floor. Crime scene technician Victoria McIlveen described how she had painstakingly collected and documented the scene. Every blood spatter, smear, and the stains, they were carefully recorded. She testified to recovering Stan Cook's entire outfit from the bedroom, his grey t-shirt, trousers, socks, shoes, jacket, even that small handgun, evidence that would play a kind of pivotal role. DNA testing confirmed the presence of 3 individuals at the scene: Dale, Marissa, and Stan. The sheets were soaked with Dale's blood and his semen, and Marissa's clothing was stained with Dale's blood, though there weren't any defensive wounds found on her. Stan's shirt carried blood spatters, inconsistent with being the initial attacker, and his socks were drenched in blood, almost as if he paced across the bloodied floor. The blood spatter pattern told a brutal story. The prosecution concluded that Dale had likely been lying down, probably asleep, when the attack began. The distribution of blood on Marissa's shirt matched a right-handed swing of a claw hammer's ball end, the very hammer that was recovered from the scene, wrapped meticulously in white plastic and then sealed in cellophane. Blood on Stan's shirt, by contrast, suggested he was further from the initial blows, a detail that contradicted those earlier statements. Medical experts gave chilling testimony about Dale's injuries. 3 separate blows to the right side of his skull inflicted a depressed skull fracture, multiple hematomas beneath the surface of the skull, and brain contusions so severe that emergency surgery was required. The prosecution highlighted the inaccuracies, discrepancies between Marissa's version of events and the physical evidence. Paramedics testified that there were no visible signs of strangulation on Marissa, contradicting her claim of being choked. At trial, there was particular focus on the roommate, Stan. He'd obviously given these conflicting accounts, and they really wanted to get to the bottom of it if they could. So Stan sat in the witness chair and explained how he'd had a motorcycle accident, quote, "I hit a truck at 40 miles an hour. Sometimes I can't remember things." The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Cook, where were you January 14th, 2009? Stan hesitated before saying he didn't remember. "I can't remember last week, much less 5 years ago, but I think I was there." "Did you hit Dale Harrell with a hammer?" "I'm not sure," Stan replied. "Is it true that Marissa helps you to remember things?" the prosecutor asked. "Well, yes, so does Wikipedia. I don't think a person can put memories in your brain." A brief pause, then, "Do you remember discussing wedding rings with Marissa?" Stan nodded slowly. Before the prosecutor asked, "You two were planning on getting married, weren't you?" He replied, "I think so. We might have talked about it, I can't remember for sure." His confusion was visible now. "Did you hit Marissa with a sledgehammer to make it look like Dale abused her?" Stan's answer was cold and flat. "I can't remember." The prosecution leaned in for one final question. "Do you love her?" "Yes." Oh, I don't know. I think this for me made it clear that Stan is being manipulated. And I'm not saying as well that he's like totally innocent. I think it's quite clear that, and this is suggested in the book that I read, that Stan perhaps uses his brain injury to just kind of not answer any of the questions or just say he doesn't remember at all. But it's also clear that Marissa's saying that she loves him, or there's some kind of romantic bond connection between the two of them, to the point where they're looking at rings together. I do think in this situation, Stan has been wildly manipulated. The defense attorney did then approach the witness stand with Stan still on it and asked, "Do you remember me?" And Stan said no. The defense attorney said, "We've had many meetings together. Are you sure you don't remember me?" And Stan looked up before finally saying maybe. So again, I think he's maybe doing this in a way to just kind of get out of answering any questions. Another piece of evidence presented specifically about Stan was that confession. The defense showed that on February 4th, 2009, a typewritten confession appeared on Alan's computer. It was supposedly written by Stan, and just 5 days later, on February 9th, Stan brought that letter himself to the police department. The confession itself was riddled with inconsistencies that just didn't fit the forensic evidence. But what that confession did do is that it raised questions about who truly controlled the narrative. Obviously, Alan had been given complete immunity in exchange for his testimony. It meant that his word was shielded from prosecution, no matter what role he played behind the scenes. The defense and prosecution kind of fought over whether Alan was a manipulative puppet master who was actually pulling the strings, or simply this concerned partner caught in this dangerous web. I know which one I think. The prosecution argued that Alan had coerced or heavily influenced Stan's confession, ensuring that the blame fell away from Marissa and onto Stan. The defense insisted that this was a classic tactic to kind of muddy the waters and just divert attention from the actual case. And so, Alan now took the stand. He faced the relentless scrutiny of cross-examination. Andrew, the defense attorney, began with a pointed line of questioning. "You have been granted complete immunity from the state, haven't you, Mr. Flores?" "Yes," Alan replied. "Had you not been granted immunity, you would have been charged in this case, wouldn't you?" "Yes," Alan answered again. "Isn't it true that you would have been charged with being an accessory to murder?" "Yes." Is it also true you would have been charged with hindering a police investigation? Yes. Andrew pressed further. Wasn't Stan's letter of confession found on your computer? Alan hesitated before saying yes, but it was on there because it was on a thumb drive and he was interrupted. Just answer the question you have been asked, Mr. Flores. The prosecution had also asked him, do you still love her? And Alan's voice was barely audible as he said no. Silence. Then a twisted turn. Alan was asked, are you aware of the videos we found on your computer? Wasn't it your practice to film yourself having sex with various women? Alan admitted, I did, that was a few years ago. Was it? Didn't you videotape yourself and the defendant, Marissa DeVault, having sex? Alan replied that yes, he did. Did the defendant know you were taping her during sex? I told her later. How long later? About 6 weeks afterwards. And how did the defendant react when she found out? She was fine with it, Alan answered. The final blow came with a cold, legal weight. You were also granted immunity from a charge that would have carried a life sentence. Are you aware of that? Yes. The charge that carries a life sentence is possession of child pornography found on your computer. Did you have child pornography on your computer? Alan replied, yes, but that was a long time ago. Your response requires a yes or no. Is it true that child pornography was found on your computer? Alan admitted, it is true. So yeah, you might not have seen that coming, but you could see how I felt about Alan from the off. And do you know what? Even if that last part hadn't been included, even if we didn't know that, I feel that his character and the evidence that had been found against him, even though it couldn't been used, I thought that was telling enough in itself. The jury absorbed every word. The layers of Alan's secrets were now fully exposed, and the man who held Marissa's financial strings, the man whose testimony shaped the case, had all of his skeletons, maybe not all of them, but it had his skeletons laid out bare. And I think that the confession letter in itself and Alan's integrity became a real symbol of the trial's complexity. It's a man who was not someone you'd believe after all of that was said and done. Well, I wouldn't anyway. And then the next witness, and this is someone I mentioned very briefly in part 1, Travis Tatro. He took the witness stand. His connection to Marissa was kind of murky and a bit distant, to be honest. They were once lovers nearly 7 years ago, and then strangers until an unexpected phone call changed that. Under questioning, Travis spoke about that phone call that had happened in 2009. He said, she told me her husband had died of stomach cancer long ago. The prosecutor asked, did you meet up with her after that? And Travis admitted he did. Let's just say she can be pretty persuasive when she wants to be. I thought I'd hear her out. And what happened when you got together? Travis said she admitted that Dale was in fact alive and that she wanted him to take care of Dale. The prosecution asked, what do you mean take care of him? Well, I figured she just wanted me to slap him around a bit. I didn't think she meant, you know. Did she ever ask you to kill him? The prosecution asked. No, she never said that outright, but I did go to her house to talk about it and Dale was there. I wanted out. I realised this dude was back from the dead and wanted nothing to do with it. The prosecutor asked, did she say anything else to you? She said she'd take care of it in her own way. What did you think that meant? Travis hesitated before answering. I figured she wanted him whacked or some shit. I don't know. She lies at the drop of a hat. I wanted out and I got out. The prosecution then presented more evidence that really cast a light on Marissa's story. Digital footprints showed that Marissa had repeatedly searched online for phrases like using abuse as a defense in trial, for 5 times she'd scoured the internet, hunting for ways to turn trauma into a legal shield. Next, an audio recording was played. Marissa's voice was heard. Dale was on the bed facing the computer towards the wall. I went to the bathroom, and on the way back, I just picked up the hammer and hit him. I took both my hands and wrapped them around the hammer and hit him again and again. I kept saying, "You don't own me," and I hit him again. The prosecutor said, "That's premeditation. Forget for a moment the insurance policies and everything else we'd heard. Dale was lying down, probably sleeping, when she decided to pick up the hammer and drive it into his head." There was no threat, no immediate danger. That hammer was a choice. It was cold and deliberate and merciless. And I know I keep bouncing around in terms of timeline with the confession letter, but it's just something I couldn't get out of my mind. And it's because Marissa changed her story so many times. Why had she changed her story back to Stan with those confession letters on February 4th? Well, it was clear that if she'd have been found to have killed Dale, no matter what the reason, she wouldn't get the payout. But if someone else did, she would get the payout, which kind of made me think, I mean, I already thought this, but now even more so, it confirmed for me that Alan was probably involved in that bit, allegedly, in my opinion. I think Marissa called him up and said, "Oh shit, you won't get the insurance payout, all that money I owe you, unless we find a way to say someone else killed Dale." The prosecution ended their case. Quote, "Dale lived for 27 agonising days. His jaw was wired shut, tubes down his throat, countless tubes piercing his body. He was conscious. He knew what happened to him. He felt the pain, every second, every breath. This injury was caused by Marissa DeVault. She made choices. She chose the hammer, even though a gun was just feet away." On January 22nd, 2014, after weeks of harrowing testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Marissa DeVault was found guilty of first-degree murder in the brutal killing of her husband. She showed little emotion as the decision was read aloud, just a quiet, unreadable expression as her fate was sealed. The same woman who had spun so very many versions of the truth now faced the one reality she could not rewrite. She was going to die in prison or on death row. The jury would be the ones to decide this, and they deliberated. When the verdict finally came, it was by a razor-thin margin. One vote spared Marissa DeVault the death penalty. Marissa wielded that hammer with chilling finality. Multiple blows, each one a deliberate strike that shattered, well, more than just bone. In that moment, she not only ended a life, but she fractured the fragile world of her children. She knew what she was doing. She knew that killing Dale would rip apart her children's lives, leaving them without a father and now without a mother. Premeditation was undeniable. There was no desperate act of last-minute survival. It was cold, calculated, and carried out with full awareness of the destruction it would bring. The court sentenced her to life in prison with no parole. That night, Dale Harrell went to bed unaware that it would be his last, unaware that the woman beside him had already made a choice that would shift the lives of countless individuals, including the 3 children, forever. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of REDRUM. I've been loving doing these 2-parters recently. I really love getting into the detail of these cases. Please let me know what you thought about today's case. I love reading your thoughts and theories and comments. Okay, so for today's recommendation, I've got a podcast for you. If you are anything like me, which I guess you are because you're listening to REDRUM, I'm telling you REDRUM, and especially with these 2-parters, then I think you probably will love this. Just any kind of true crime that digs beneath the surface. So I've been listening to a podcast called Pretend, recommended by my wonderful friend Naomi Channel over at Real. And the season specifically that I want to recommend is called The Stalker. This one will stay with me. I don't want to give too much away, but Basically, the host, Javier, explores real life stories of people who, pretend, I suppose. This particular series is about this couple who keep getting like quite intense trolling. It's really dark, it's really disturbing, and it's so important. I binged the whole season in literally one weekend, so let me know if you have a listen. Oh, and finally, guys, I've had a few people over the years ask if I would ever do a live show. I never really thought about it because I just didn't think, the REDRUM audience is all over the world, so I wasn't sure there would be the audience for it. It's one thing listening to a true crime podcast in your bedroom, at home, in the car, but actually leaving the house and trekking to a venue to come hear me chat about true crime. I don't know. But I've had a fair few people ask, so I wanted to get an idea of if there is actual interest. It'd be in the UK, probably London, for an evening sometime. I'm going to put a sign-up link in the description box so you can register your interest if you'd fancy that. No commitment, just if you would fancy that, let me know. We'd make it fun and interesting. I imagine there'd be loads of solo people going along, so it might be a good chance to meet other true crime interested, like-minded people like you, like me. Anyway, if you would want to come, click the sign up link in the description box, and if enough people sign up, then I'll look into doing one for sure. Other than that, I will see you guys next week for your next episode of REDRUM. Bye.